We're starting in the book of Ruth today. So we're going to go through the book of Ruth. It's 4 chapters. Planning on doing a chapter each week through the end of January. And I thought this would be a really powerful way to start off this new year. My aim in preaching through the book of Ruth is the next 4 Sundays, 1 chapter each Sunday. One way that you can make January a very memorable month, I think, would be if you actually take the time to read through the book of Ruth in one sitting. I think you can get a lot from reading through it in one sitting, and it will only take you about 20 minutes to 25 minutes to read through the book of Ruth, and it's well worth the time that you spend reading it. It's a story that shows how God moves in a mysterious way, His wonders to perform. It's a story for people who wonder where God is when their dreams and the prophets aren't speaking or visions aren't being seen. It's for people who wonder where God is when one tragedy after another attacks their faith. It's a story for people who wonder whether a life of integrity in tough times is worth it. And it's a story for people who can't imagine that anything great could ever come out of their ordinary life of faith. It's a refreshing and encouraging book, and I want you to refresh and encourage yourself this upcoming year and for the rest of this season to be people that are truly walking and living by faith despite the surrounding circumstances. And some of us may be facing different issues or struggles in our lives, but God ultimately is in control. And something that's so powerful that Ruth understood was that she was going to follow after God. And we're going to talk about that as we read chapter 1 this morning. But I want to give you a little information about the Moabites. You've probably heard of the Moabites, but you probably don't know too much about the Moabites. Has anybody ever done any research about the Moabites? Yeah, most of the time we don't sit there wondering about the Moabites. But I want to share a little bit about the Moabites. In the Old Testament accounts, we can really see quite a bit about them in Genesis 19:30 through 38. And the Moabites belonged to the same ethnic stock as the Israelites. Their ancestral founder was Moab, and Moab was the son of Lot. So Lot was the brother of, does anybody know? Abraham. Kind of fascinating. So their ancestral founder was Moab, and then Lot was his dad. So his uncle was Abraham. Now, what's strange is they went one way, and Abraham went the other way. The Israelites worshipped who? Yahweh, right? Now, the Moabites, they actually worshiped Chemosh. And Chemosh was, the Israelites had Yahweh, they had Chemosh. And Chemosh was their god. And you may not know this, and I had forgotten this as I was doing some research, that King Solomon erected a small temple in Israel to Chemosh because, as you may know, Ruth leads up to Christ, right? So Solomon was from the descendants of Moabites. So he takes this foreign god and places a temple next to the real temple, and ultimately Josiah comes along as the king of Israel, and he wipes out that temple to Chemosh. And some scholars believe that the goddess Astarte was probably the cult partner of Chemosh. The Moabites were in conflict with Israel since the 13th century. So there's some interesting things when we read in the scriptures about the Moabites. That's the history, some of the history behind the Moabites and how they became a people group. So is anybody in the book of Ruth right now? All right. In the book of Ruth, it's important that when we read it, that we read it, every bit of it, because we got to understand what it's actually referring to. And when it talks about Moabites, when it talks about the Israelites, when it talks about whatever it talks about, we got to read it in its entirety so we understand the context. In the days when the judges ruled, all right, right there, the judges. The judges ruled during this time period. And it's important to note that because it's before there was ever a king of Israel. So it was prior to there ever being a king in Israel, and the judges were ruling at this point. And there were different judges, but in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Remember we just talked about the Moabites? So because of the famine, he moved to Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his sons were Molon and Chilion. They were Ephrates from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Molon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. I don't know if you understand how significant that is, because in this culture, the husband would take care of the family, and if the husband passed away, does anyone know who would take care of the family next? The firstborn son. But she only had 2 sons, so both of her sons died. Guess what happened? She had nobody. She had nobody to take care of her. And because she had nobody, guess what happens with Naomi? What would happen to you? Well, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept out loud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons. Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept out loud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Did you hear what that said? Your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. There was a plural, gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. When she realized, you see how extreme Ruth went in her statements? She's like, "No matter what, I'm going with you." But then said when Naomi realized, yeah, how can you not realize, right? She realized it right away. She's like, wow, I can't. This girl, she's saying, hey, I'll even, where you die, I'm going to die. I'm going to worship your gods. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Have you ever seen God work in dark times, when things are dark and they don't seem like they're going to go the way in which you thought your life would go or the way in which you think the next day should go? Well, according to 1:1, the story took place during the time of the Judges. This was a 400-year period after Israel entered into the Promised Land. And when they entered into the Promised Land, some of them were struck down because of their unbelief. They did things that they shouldn't have done, but they entered into this Promised Land because of 2 spies that went in. There were 12 that went in. 2 said they could take it. With the Lord's power behind them, they could overtake the giants of the land. And guess what? They believed in those 2, and they went into the land, and they took over the Promised Land. But for 400 years, they did not have a king, and they had judges, and they spoke for God. And under Joshua and before there were any kings in Israel, it was roughly 15 BC to 1100 BC. The book of Judges comes just before Ruth in our English Bibles, and you can see from its very first verse that it talks about the book of Judges. It talks about judges reigning, right? And my family, actually, we just started reading the book of Judges last night. So we just started reading the first chapter in Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Did you hear that? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. In many, many ways, we are in a country that people are doing what's right in their own eyes, right? The people would sin. God would send enemies against them. The people would cry for help, and God would protect them in some way, shape, or form. And he would show his mercy and raise up a judge to deliver them. Again and again, people rebelled. If you go through the book of Judges, you're going to find again and again, there's rebellion. God brings a judge. The judge helps set them straight. And then they rebel again, and God brings a judge, and the people get set straight. And then they rebel again, and they worship false gods, and all sorts of craziness happens. They get into all sorts of immoral behavior. Then God brings a judge, and their immorality stops. They repent, and they follow God, and boom, it happens again. Again and again, they rebelled. What the book of Ruth does for us is giving us a glimpse into the way in which God works during the worst of times. And I've known a lot of people that have gone through really, really bad times, confusing times, times of real difficulty and struggle. How is God working in the midst of struggle and difficulty and tragedy? Look at the last verse of Ruth 4:22. In 4:22, the child born to Ruth and Boaz, I just spoiled, this is a spoiler alert, right? The child born to Ruth and Boaz during this period of the Judges is Obed. He becomes the father of Jesse. And Jesse becomes the father of David. And David was the greatest king to ever reign. And then Solomon came from David, right? And Solomon was the most wise king ever to reign. So guess what? All this tragedy and all this sorrow and all this difficulty and all this confusion. And Naomi even calls herself bitter. I mean, she renames herself bitter. That's what that means. She goes from pleasant, Naomi means pleasant, and then Mara means bitter. So she goes, don't call me pleasant anymore. Oh, I'm bitter. You won't believe what I've gone through. I lost my husband, my 2 sons. I was in a foreign land. Now I come to this land. I am miserable. And she says, just call me bitter. Have you ever known anybody that didn't call themselves bitter, but they were bitter? And if you've ever been around a bitter person, it's not pleasant. Something I like to say is, don't be bitter, be better. Right? Like, when we become bitter people, we begin to really look into ourselves and we become all about ourselves. And recently I was on the phone with somebody that was in pain, but they refused to listen to anything I said. It was because they were so internally focused on themselves and even their sin that they couldn't separate themselves from their sin and their self to see that God could work in the midst of pain and affliction. And it's hard to see that. I think as we read through the book of Ruth and talk about it, we're going to see that in the midst of our personal affliction, our personal trials, our personal struggles, that God is at work in the worst of times. When you think He is farthest from you, or has even turned against you, the truth is that He is laying the foundation stones of greater joy for this life, even if it doesn't seem like it, even if it seems like this struggle that will never end. God's like, hey, I got this, I got you, I'm going to take care of you, you're following me? Oh, I'm going to take care of you, even though it doesn't seem like I'm going to take care of you right now. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust Him for His grace. Behind a frowning providence, He hides a smiling face. I think that's the message of Ruth. Let's see how this unknown author helps us reshape our theology and our focus and our understanding of what God is actually doing in the midst of struggle. In verses 1 through 5, they describe the misery of Naomi. In 1:1, there's a famine in Judah, and Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, and her sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they lived there, but then they hit the road and they shot away and they went to the land of the Moabites because there wasn't a famine in that land. Have you ever noticed that when you're reading through the scriptures and you find people in famine and they go to a foreign land, it often leads to struggle and trouble? Have you ever noticed that at all? Nobody? Well, we can actually see that quite frequently in the different scripture texts, that when people are going to foreign lands during famines, that struggle happens in some significant ways. Not only that, sometimes they compromise their faith in order to get what they want. Have you ever done that? Naomi knows good and well who causes famines. She knows that God does. God allows them to happen, right? In Leviticus 26, 3 through 4, it says, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rains in their season, and the land shall yield its increase. See, where she was residing in Judah, the people were not doing what God wanted them to do, right? And I will give you your rains in the season. But there's something that says, you got to follow me, right? If you're not following me, I'm not going to provide like you want me to provide. I'm not just going to do what you want me to do because you want me to do it. When the rains are withheld, it is the hard hand of God. Then there is the decision to sojourn toward Moab, a pagan land with foreign gods. Because you remember it said that go back to your mother and their gods. Your gods, she said. God had called his people to be separate from the surrounding lands. So when Naomi's husband dies, what could she feel but the judgment of God upon her life? And then the famine, everything that happened, she felt the judgment of God upon her life. Then her two sons take Moabite wives. Okay, they go to Moab. Now her sons take Moabite wives that their families were worshiping false gods. So Naomi's in this land. Her husband dies. They have Moabite wives, and they've gone in a different direction than God would have had them go because they were afraid about the famine, right? They fled because of the famine. They were afraid they were going to die in the land. Years later, she finds out that God provided for the people, right? Verse 5 sums it up. Naomi's tragedy after 10 years of childless marriages with her two sons and their wives. Both of them died. So that the women end up not being married to her sons. So she feels like she has nothing anymore. A famine, a move to pagan Moab, the death of her husband, the marriage of her two sons to foreign wives, and the death of her sons, blow after blow, tragedy after tragedy, grief after grief. And now what? Now what? Naomi goes, Lord, what is going on? Right? And Naomi tries to turn back Ruth and Orpah. Says, hey, go back. Go back to your mothers. Go back to your homeland and your gods. In verse 6, Naomi gets word that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. So she decides to return to Judah. Her two daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, they decide to go with her, right? And as they're on their journey, we see what happens. But then, in verses 8 through 13, she tries to persuade them to go back home. I think there are 3 reasons why the writer devotes so much space to Naomi's effort for Ruth and Orpah to go back home. And these 3 ways, I think they're really significant. The first thing, the scene emphasizes Naomi's misery. So we see in the first part, Naomi, her misery is enormous. For example, in verse 11, Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they can become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband." All right, she's basically said, I can't do anything anymore. I'm too old to have a husband now. Do you think she was actually too old to have a husband? Is anybody ever too old to have a husband, or a wife? Some would say, I don't know, maybe I am, right? But she doesn't have what she thinks they need, right? She's saying, hey, I'm looking up for you. I don't have anything to offer you. In other words, Naomi had nothing to offer, nothing at all. Her condition is worse than theirs. If they try to be faithful to her and to the name of their husbands, they will find nothing but pain, nothing but sorrow, nothing but anguish. That's what Naomi's saying to them. Hey, listen, I'm bitter. She didn't call herself bitter yet, but she knew she was bitter. So she concludes at the end of verse 13, "No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Don't come with me because God is against me. Your life may be as bitter as mine. That's the ESV translation. I wanted to show that bitter, 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 bitter. She's all about bitter. You're going to be bitter like me. I'm bitter. You're going to be bitter. We're going to be bitter together, and we'll be extra bitter. We're marinated in our bitterness. And then our lives will be even more bitter than anybody that we ever see. Then we find this Israelite custom. So this is the second reason for verses 8 through 13 is to prepare us for a custom in Israel, which is going to turn everything around for Naomi in the following chapters. The custom was that when an Israelite husband died, his brother or a near relative would marry that woman and carry on the seed of the family. Naomi is referring to this custom in verse 11 when she says she has no sons to marry Ruth or Orpah. She thinks it is hopeless for Ruth and Orpah to remain committed to the family. She doesn't remember, evidently, that she has a relative named Boaz, right? Who might perform the duty as one for the brother. There's a lesson here. When we have decided that God is against us, we usually exaggerate our hopelessness. We become so bitter, we can't see the rays of light peeping through the clouds and that are hitting us right on the face, but we focus so much on the big cloud that we can't see those lights piercing through. Allow those piercing bits of light to hit your face. And realize that in the midst of times when you feel bitter, that God is about to make things better. It was God who preserved a kinsman to continue Naomi's line. And it was God who constrains Ruth to stay with Naomi. But Naomi is so embittered by God's hard province that she can't see His mercy at work in her own life. She just cannot see past all the junk and debris. She can't see what God's actually at work doing. She doesn't even remember Boaz. She doesn't even think about that because she's so caught up in her grief. She's a widow. Her children have died. She is just embittered with grief and frustration and sorrow and confusion. The third reason for verses 8 through 13 is to make Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi appear amazing. Verse 14 says that Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. It doesn't say that Ruth just stood around. Ruth clung to her. What would that be like if you're in a place of true bitterness? You're an overly bitter person, and you're telling everybody to get away from you, and somebody comes along and clings to you. I'm not letting you go. I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to be with you for the rest of your life. Naomi's probably like, just get off me. Right? Leave me alone. I told you to go. Go away. Oh, I'm not leaving you. But not only am I not leaving you, I'm not going to leave you. And I'm even going to die where you die. I'm going to worship the God that you worship. I'm going to follow after that God wholeheartedly. And it doesn't say if Ruth knew about the God of Israel through her husband, if her husband shared with her, listen, the God Yahweh is the true God. And maybe her husband poured into her and shared with her, and that's why her faith was so much deeper than Orpah's. Not even another entreaty in verse 15 can get Ruth to leave. This is all the more amazing after Naomi's grim description of their future with her. Ruth stays with her in spite of an apparently hopeless future widowed and childless. For a woman back then, it was very important for them to be married and with a child because, unfortunately, in those days, women were not in the workplace. They weren't bringing in the money, and they weren't able to really support anything. That's why a lot of women turn to prostitution and other means. So the amazing words of Ruth are found in 16 through 17. Entreat me not to leave you or return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if even death parts me from you. The more you ponder these words, the more amazing these words become. Ruth's commitment to her destitute mother-in-law is simply astonishing. First, it means leaving her own family and land. Second, it means as far as she knows, a life of widowed and childlessness, it lies ahead for the rest of her life, the rest of her days, a widow and childless. Because Naomi has no man to give. And if she married a non-relative, her commitment to Naomi's family would be lost. And third, it means going to an unknown land with a new people and new customs and new language. And fourth, it was a commitment even more radical than marriage. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. In other words, she will never return home, not even if Naomi dies. Wow. You ever have someone commit to you like that? That's incredible. But the most amazing commitment of all is this: your God will be my God. Naomi has just said in verse 13, the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. Naomi's experience of God was bitter. But in spite of this, Ruth forsakes her religion, her heritage, her customs, her family, her culture, everything, and says, my God will be your God, and I'm going to follow after your God. Even though you paint a bitter picture of your God, I'm going to trust and believe that Yahweh is the true way, the truth, and the life, right? Perhaps she had made that commitment years before. Perhaps she had committed to Yahweh in conversations with her brother-in-law and her husband, and maybe even with Naomi and with Naomi's husband. Maybe they shared the story of the Red Sea and how the sea parted, how they walked across, how God protected them, how manna from heaven came, how maybe all these stories were so real and so amazing. And she saw God working in the lives of her spouse and her mother-in-law. It doesn't really give us any idea why Ruth made such a profound commitment, but she did. Here we have a picture of God's ideal woman. So you may say, how can I truly be a woman after God's heart? What does that even look like? Faith in God that sees beyond present bitter setbacks. Freedom from the securities and comforts of the world. Courage to venture into the unknown and the strange. Radical commitment in the relationships appointed by God. Oh, that Bethlehem might breed that kind of woman, right? There's this call out. Oh, Lord, may Bethlehem breed, may this be produced, a woman like this. Ruth became a woman that is modeling what it means to be a woman that follows wholeheartedly after God. But not only that, she can teach us men some significant lessons on what it means to follow after God. But women, if you're interested in following after God with everything. Look at the life of Ruth. Look at how committed and devoted she is to God. Naomi's theology, it was right and it was wrong. So when you can look at Naomi, you can see correct theology and incorrect theology. So Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem of Judah in verse 19. But she responds in verse 20. Do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant or sweet. Call me Mara, bitter, right? For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has afflicted me? And the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. What do you make of Naomi's theology? I would take Naomi's theology any day over the sentimental views of God which dominate evangelical magazines and evangelical circles today. Even evangelical books. Naomi is unshaken and sure about three things. God exists, God is sovereign, and God has afflicted her. Those three things she's sure. The problem with Naomi is that she has forgotten the story of Joseph, who also went through a foreign country. He also was sold as a slave. Well, she wasn't, but he was sold as a slave. He was framed by an adulterous woman and put into prison to die. He had every reason to say with Naomi, the Almighty has dealt me a bitter hand. But he kept his faith, and he turned to God and followed God. In all his personal good for Israel's national good. The key lesson in Genesis 50:20 is this. As for you, you meant it for evil against me. This is to Joseph's brothers. But God meant it for good. So he's speaking to his brothers who he hasn't seen for years and years and years. And they come to him because of a famine. And guess what? He says this to them. As for you, you meant it for evil against me. But God meant it for good. Naomi is right to believe in a sovereign, almighty God who governs the affairs of the nations and families and gives each day its part of pain and pleasure. But she needs to open her eyes to the signs of her merciful purpose and God's merciful purpose in her life. And when we don't open our eyes to see God's mercy at work in the midst of calamity, we can't see God fully. It was God who took away the famine and opened a way home. Just like God brought Joseph's brothers in a time of famine, and they were going and trekking to a land, but they were some of the few that were surprised to see they made compromise along the way, didn't they? But they trekked to a land, and Joseph happened to be there and blessed them. But they felt cursed, didn't they? Because they realized that was their brother. So they got blessed by Joseph, but they felt the heaviness and they felt cursed. What have we done? And other people that went to a place because of a famine. What would she say if she could see that in Ruth she would gain a man-child, and that man-child would be the grandfather of the greatest king of Israel? And that king of Israel would foreshadow the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. What would Naomi say about that? I think she would say, judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. All right, hang with me. I'm going to wrap it up, but I got 4 things I want to share that I think are really important from this text. God's sovereign rule. So these are some of the 4 summary lessons. I think the first one is God's sovereign rule. God the Almighty reigns in all the affairs of humanity. He rules the nations, and He rules families. His providence extends from the U.S. Congress to the kitchen. Let's be like the woman of faith in the Old Testament. Whatever else they doubted, they never doubted that God was involved. They never doubted that God was a part of their lives. And they stayed committed to God. We can look over and over. We see men fleeing and running from God, but we see these women knowing and realizing that God is still God, and they're committed to God. We can learn a lot from most of the women that we read about in the Scriptures. And I think we don't emphasize the power that the women had in the Scriptures. Often we're talking about the men in the Scriptures. The women had incredible integrity. They did amazing things for God. And they produced men of integrity that did amazing things for God. Wow. You go, girls. Whatever else they doubted, they never doubted that God was involved in every part of their lives, and that none could stay His hand. Daniel 4:35, we can see that. He gives rain and He takes rain. He gives life and He takes life. In Him we live and move and have our being. Nothing from a toothpick to the Taj Mahal is rightly understood except in relation to God. He is the all-encompassing, all-pervading reality. Naomi was right, and we should join her in this conviction. God the Almighty reigns in all the affairs of humanity. The second thing is God's mysteries, His mysterious providence. God's mysterious providence. His providence is powerful. God's providence is sometimes very hard. God had dealt bitterly with Naomi, at least in the short run. It could only feel like bitterness. Perhaps someone will say it was all owing to the sin of going to Moab and marrying foreign wives. Maybe so, but not necessarily. In Psalm 34:19 it says, "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." Neither the Old Testament or the New Testament promises that believers will escape affliction in their life. There are people that are preaching today that say, if you follow in faith, that you will not be afflicted with any ailment, that you will live a healthy life, a wealthy life, and you'll be healthy, wealthy, and wise. Look at the Scriptures. That's not factual. Just because we live for Christ doesn't mean we won't be afflicted. Look at Job's life. Job was a man, the most righteous man at that time in history, and he got afflicted, didn't he? But suppose Naomi's calamity was owing to her disobedience. That makes the story doubly encouraging because it shows that God is willing and able even to turn His judgments into joys. If Ruth was brought into the family by sin, it is doubly astonishing that she is made the grandmother of David, an ancestor of Jesus. Don't ever think that the sin of your past means that there is no hope in your future. And the third thing, God's good purposes. So, not only does God reign in all the affairs of men and women, and not only in the providence sometimes hard, but in all His works, His purposes are for the good and joy of His people. Who would have imagined that in the worst of all times, the period of the judges, God was quietly moving in the tragedies of a single family to prepare the way for the greatest king of Israel. But not only that, he was working to fill Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and their friends with great joy. If anything, this new year has fallen in on you and me for a future that may look hopeless because of what we see all around us. But we need to learn from Ruth that God is right now at work in the future and in the hope that we have. Because the hope is within us, and the hope is Christ in us. Trust Him. Wait patiently. That ominous clouds are big with mercy and will break with blessing. Those are those clouds overhead. There's mercy in the midst of the clouds. There's light shining through, and we need to see it. And the fourth thing, we learn that if you trust the sovereign goodness and mercy of God to pursue you all the days of your life, then you will, like Ruth, be free. So, the fourth thing is we want freedom like Ruth. If God calls you and calls you to leave your family, you can leave your job, you can leave Massachusetts, and you can make radical commitments and undertake new ventures that maybe you at this point in this juncture don't feel comfortable. Maybe even tomorrow, God's going to speak to you and say, hey, it's time to move on. It's time to go where God wants you to go. When you believe in the sovereignty of God and that He loves to work mightily for those who trust Him, it gives a freedom and a joy that can't be shaken in hard times. The book of Ruth gives us a glimpse into the hidden work of God during the worst times. And so, like all of the scriptures, as Paul says in Romans 15:4 and 13, Ruth was written that we may abound in hope. Let's pray. Father, allow us to abound in your hope, not to abound in the things of this world, the passions of this world, the desires of this world, the confusion of this world, the affliction of this world, but Lord, to abound in hope. Lord, may we abound in hope so mightily and so powerfully, Lord, that hope just overflows in our hearts and minds. Amen.